Imagine living through a medieval winter. Not in a castle with roaring fires and feasts, but as an ordinary peasant. No knights, no glory, just cold, hunger, and silence. Snow blows through your roof. Bread freezes hard as stone. Wolves creep closer to your door. Every day you wake up and fight to survive. If this honest, grounded history helps you relax, feel free to like this video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. There's comfort in knowing who else is out there tonight. Dim your lights, maybe turn on a fan for soft background noise. Wrap yourself in something warm. And let's begin. Winter didn't just arrive like a season, it came like a warning, like a force that didn't care who you were or what you had. It didn't simply test people's strength or patience. It tried to end them, to wear them down slowly and completely. You didn't need a calendar to know it was near. You could feel it deep in your body, in the ache of your joints, in the heaviness in your chest when you woke up. The sky changed too, turned a dull gray, and seemed to hesitate before letting the sun through, as if even the light wasn't sure it wanted to face the cold. The air carried a kind of silence that felt unnatural. It wasn't peaceful. It was tense, like the world was holding its breath. The animals knew before people did. They grew restless and alert. Chickens stopped their clucking and scratching in the dirt, huddling close instead. Dogs didn't bark as much anymore. They stood still with ears up, listening to things only they could hear. Even birds flew lower or disappeared completely. Autumn didn't end with a final blaze of color. It didn't bow out gracefully. It simply backed away, step by step, like someone retreating from something too big to face. The trees stood bare, stripped of their leaves, their branches creaking in the wind like old bones. Inside your home, no matter how well you tried to prepare, the cold found a way in. The wind slid through the smallest cracks in your walls, and under your door. It stole warmth from your blankets, from your skin, from your very breath. Fires had to be kept going constantly, not just for comfort, but for survival. The warmth from the flames never seemed to spread far enough. You'd sit close to the fire, but your back would still feel the chill like a hand pressed against it. The sun, when it came, didn't offer much help. It looked pale and tired, like it was struggling just to rise each day. It cast long, cold shadows and gave more light than heat. People changed too. They moved differently. They walked faster, not because they were late or in a hurry, but because stopping meant feeling the cold dig deeper into their bodies. Conversations were shorter. Smiles were rarer. Everyone's face seemed set in the same expression, tight, focused, bracing for something worse. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a fight. Every day was a battle against the cold, against hunger, against loneliness. And every sound, every movement, every breath reminded you that you had to keep going. Even when everything around you seemed to be shutting down or giving up. Winter arrived quietly, like death. At first you pretended. It was just a chill. You wore the same thin clothes, promising to mend them later, but your hands were too numb to hold a needle. Nobody was ever truly ready. There was always a roof to fix or wood to chop. You stuffed straw into wall gaps, hung cloth over doorways, and moved beds closer to the fire, even next to Uncle Gan, who smelled like sheep. You only lit fires for cooking or a short evening cheer. The rest of the time, you relied on layers, movement, and huddling with siblings under scratchy blankets. Animals felt it too. Chickens huddled, pigs went silent, cows got grumpy. Outside, the ground turned to iron. Paths became icy traps. Water buckets grew skins of ice you broke each morning. The sky hung low and gray, like it was waiting. In town, people spoke less. Jokes disappeared. Church sermons turned darker. Priests called cold God's lesson in humility. You wondered if God could teach that lesson somewhere warmer. Then came the snow. It didn't arrive with howling winds or crashing storms, just a light, soft dusting, like someone had tipped over a bag of flour and let it fall gently over the land. It looked harmless at first, barely covering the ground, but it changed everything. The world turned white, and a deep silence settled over everything. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Sound was swallowed up, muffled by the snow, as if the earth itself had decided to sleep. The roads disappeared. The fields were hidden under a white blanket. It felt like the world had closed its doors, locking you inside for the long cold. Stretch ahead. Once the snow fell, there was no more planting or digging, no more gathering or preparing. The season of growing was over. Whatever food and fuel you had saved was now all you could count on. There would be no more. You checked and rechecked your supplies, counting every bundle of firewood, every sack of grain, every root vegetable. Stored in the ground, every jar or bundle carefully tucked away. You looked at your turnips, your dried beans, your onions, your jars of jam, and thought, will this be enough? You watched the hens hoping for eggs, but they'd stopped laying. Even they seemed to sense the seriousness of winter. You kept yourself busy, because sitting still made the cold seem worse. You mended clothes, patching holes in socks and coats. You stirred the ashes in the fire, hoping to find a last bit of warmth. You spun wool into thread, not because you needed more, but because the motion gave your hands something to do. You swept the floor again and again, just to break the silence. You rubbed wax into boots and folded blankets that were already folded. Anything to keep from thinking too much, because when it got too quiet, your thoughts crept in. You'd start to wonder, what if the food runs out? What if the firewood doesn't last? What if someone gets sick? The silence outside became a silence inside your own head, and it could be frightening. It made you remember how small you were, how thin the line was between safety and danger, between surviving and not. So you kept moving, kept working, kept your hands busy, because in winter, stillness wasn't peace. It was a trap. As the cold deepened and the snow piled up outside, even the animals had to come indoors. Goats, chickens, and sometimes even the family cow were brought inside the house, not because anyone loved having them there, but because their body heat helped everyone survive. It was a matter of staying warm. The animals didn't want to be out in the freezing barn either, where the wind howled through the slats and water turned to ice in the buckets. So your home, already crowded with people, became a strange, noisy, and smelly mix of family and livestock. The floor was scattered with straw. There were droppings to clean up, feathers drifting through the air, and the occasional goat nudging you for food or warmth. It was messy and chaotic, but it kept everyone alive. The nights were the hardest part. Darkness came early, swallowing the sky before you were ready. By late afternoon, it already felt like night. Candles were used carefully, they were expensive, and you had only so many. Lamps burned oil, which smoked up the walls and made your eyes sting, so you didn't keep them lit for long. Most of the time, everyone just gathered around the fire. That was the warmest, brightest place in the house, the heart of everything. You wrapped yourself in blankets and sat shoulder to shoulder, trying to make the most of the heat. Someone might tell a story, maybe something from the old days, or a tale passed down from a grandparent. But more often than not, it was a ghost story. Something about a traveler lost in the snow, or a shadowy figure seen in the woods, or strange footsteps outside the door at night. You knew they were just stories meant to entertain, to pass the time, but in the quiet of winter, they felt too real. The wind outside howled like a voice. The walls creaked. The shadows moved, and when nature called, you had no choice. You had to go outside to the outhouse, even in the freezing cold, even in the dark. You bundled up, heart racing, and stepped out into the night. Every shape looked suspicious. Every tree looked like it could move. You didn't walk, you ran, boots slipping on the icy ground, eyes fixed straight ahead. You didn't dare look behind you, afraid of what might be there, or what your imagination might make you see. And once you finished, you ran back just as fast, flinging the door shut behind you, breathless and grateful for the firelight and the noisy, crowded warmth of home. There was strange comfort in the rhythm. You knew the chores, the limits. Misery loved company. Everyone was cold. You celebrated tiny victories. Warm feet for 5 minutes. Stew that tasted less like despair. A day without wind cutting through walls. You learned not to laugh too loud. Someone would remind you winter had just begun. Throughout history, peasants had a hard life, but winter made everything worse. And during the time known as the Little Ice Age, which began around the 1300s, winters became even colder, longer, and more brutal. It wasn't just about being uncomfortable, it was about survival. Rivers that usually flowed freely froze so solid that people could walk across them, even hold markets right on the ice. Boats couldn't move, fish were harder to catch, and whole towns were cut off. Snow piled up for weeks. Storms destroyed what little food could be gathered. Life slowed to a crawl. The years 1315 to 1317 were some of the worst. Across Europe, crops failed again and again. It rained too much in spring, and fields turned to mud. Seeds rotted before they could grow. Families watched their grain supplies shrink, then disappear. There was nothing left to eat, not in the fields, not in the cellars, not in the forests. Hunger spread like a sickness. It's believed that up to 30 million people died during these famine years. People grew thin and desperate. There were stories, whispers, really about people eating anything they could find, bark, dead animals. Even rumors of cannibalism. No one wanted to believe them, but the fear was there. Yet the cold wasn't the only challenge. Winter also forced people into cramped spaces, packed tightly with others. A single-room hut might hold a whole family. Maybe 6 or 7 people, plus animals like goats and chickens, and maybe even a bucket of fish caught and stored in ice. The smell was constant, a mix of smoke, sweat, livestock, and damp clothes. There was no privacy. You slept shoulder to shoulder, sometimes even sharing your bed with animals just to stay warm. You heard every sound, every cough, every sniffle, every sigh of frustration. If someone got sick, everyone risked getting sick. If someone cried at night, there was no hiding it. People became irritated, tired, and short-tempered, but arguing didn't help. Yelling stirred up the cold air in the room, and any warmth you had built up seemed to vanish with raised voices. So you held your tongue. You avoided fights not because you were feeling patient or kind, but because the cost was too high. Warmth was everything, and peace, even uneasy peace, helped preserve it. Winter wasn't just about surviving the cold or finding enough food. It was about surviving each other in the tightest, tensest conditions. That was the real test, living side by side, day after day, in a frozen world that refused to give anything easily. Firewood was more than just fuel in winter, it was life itself. Without it, you couldn't cook, couldn't keep warm, couldn't chase off the cold or the rats that crept closer at night. Firewood meant survival. It meant something hot to eat at the end of a freezing day and a chance to sleep without shaking from the cold. Without it, you were nothing more than a frozen body with a pile of unpaid taxes, a popsicle with taxes. As people grimly joked, cutting and gathering wood wasn't easy. It wasn't something you did once and forgot about. It was a constant chore, a second job that never ended. The axes were often dull, and sharpening tools took time and skill. Your hands went numb quickly in the cold, and frostbitten fingers made gripping the handle even harder. Trees didn't fall neatly either. They were big, heavy, and unpredictable. A single mistake could crush a leg or worse. But you did it anyway, because the fire needed to stay alive. When you ran out of dry wood, you had to burn what you had, even if it was wet. Wet wood filled your home with smoke. The walls turned black, your eyes stung, and the smell sank into your clothes. But smoke was better than freezing. The rich had servants to chop wood for them. They had neat piles, dry logs, and warm rooms. You didn't have servants, you were the servant. Every log you split, every bundle you carried was your own labor. Your own sweat, just to survive another night. And even then, you had to be careful. The forests weren't free. Most of the land and the trees on it belonged to the lords. Taking wood without permission was considered stealing. If you were caught, you could be fined, beaten, or worse. So peasants found other ways. They gathered brush, dug up peat from the ground, or used dried animal dung. Peat burned slowly and gave some warmth. Dung actually burned well, but the smell was awful. It filled the house with a sour, bitter smoke that no one liked. People joked that it smelled like regret because it reminded you just how poor and desperate you were. Stacking. Firewood was a job of its own. If you stacked it too tightly, it didn't get air and started to rot or grow mold. If you stacked it too loosely, the pile could fall over and crush someone or just scatter in the snow, where it froze solid. You learned the right way over. Time, and you guarded your woodpile like treasure. By February, the pile always seemed smaller. You started burning anything you could find: broken fence posts, old furniture, even wooden tools if they weren't absolutely needed. Some nights you dreamed of firewood. You thought about it constantly, counted the logs like gold coins. Because, out in the snow-covered world, warmth wasn't comfort, it was survival. And survival depended on the next piece of wood you could get your hands on. Sleeping was a gamble. If the fire died, the hut turned icy. You slept in clothes, under layers, pressed against family, not for love, but survival. Warm animals slept inside too. Chickens for eggs, pigs as radiators, cows as heaters. It was crowded, noisy, and smelled like a barn, but it beat freezing. Communities sometimes chopped wood together, not for friendship, but shared suffering. Women and children gathered kindling. Splinters, blisters, and frozen shins were normal. You kept going because fire meant life. Hunger in the past wasn't just feeling a little empty or wishing for a snack. It was something deeper, heavier, an aching, angry emptiness that lived in your body and didn't go away. It made your belly feel like a hollow cave, like something had been taken from you. You didn't just want food, you needed it in a way that hurt. You looked at bark or old leather and wondered if it could be chewed, if it might fill the space for just a little while. Hunger twisted your thoughts and made even the smallest crumbs feel valuable. Every bit of food had to be stretched as far as possible. You rationed everything carefully. Meals were simple and often depressing, usually a kind of thick stew called pottage. It wasn't a fresh dish. It was a pot of whatever you had: old beans, root vegetables like turnips or parsnips, maybe a scrap of salted meat if you were lucky. You didn't throw anything out. Each day you added new scraps to the same pot: leftovers, peelings, pieces. Too small to use on their own, the stew never fully emptied. It just kept going. People joked it tasted like boiled earth with a hint of regret, and they weren't far off. It filled your stomach, but it didn't bring much joy. Meat was a rare treat. If you had pork or beef, it was usually salted or smoked to make it last through the winter. It wasn't kept out in the open. It was hidden in high places or locked up so hungry children or adults wouldn't be tempted to sneak a bite. Eggs were just as rare. Hens often stopped laying in the cold months, and if you got one egg a week, you were lucky. It wasn't cracked open for fun. It was used carefully, maybe stirred into a bigger dish to stretch its value. Fresh fruits and vegetables were almost unheard of during winter. There were no apples, no berries, no green leaves. The only thing close was sour, fermented cabbage, sometimes eaten to help prevent scurvy, a sickness caused by lack of vitamin C. The taste was sharp and bitter, but it was better than losing teeth or becoming weak from illness. You preserved everything you could from summer and fall. Fish was salted or dried, plums were hung up to shrivel and sweeten, and berries were turned into jam. Even the smallest bit of sweetness was treasured. Nothing was wasted, not ever. Bones were boiled once, twice, sometimes even 3 times to pull out every bit of flavor and nutrition. The fat skimmed from stews was saved and used for cooking, or even for making candles. Ashes from the fire were used to make soap or mixed with water to scrub things clean. Food was too precious to throw away. If someone dared to toss out a piece of bread or scrape a plate too soon, people looked at them like they had lost their mind. That scrap could have been someone's lunch dot in those days. Hunger shaped everything. It taught people to be careful, to be creative, to never take food for granted. Every bite mattered. Every meal was a small victory against a winter that didn't care whether you had enough or not. Hunger was a constant companion. It sat with you, judged portions, whispered, "Your neighbor's squirrel stew looks good." You woke hungry, slept hungry. You stopped noticing until you smelled a neighbor's meal and considered trading a sibling. Even better off peasants ate bland, meager meals. In famine years, people ate roots, moss, or shoe leather. Monks wrote of families vanishing, parents choosing which child got the last crust. You ate cold stew by candlelight, grateful for anything chewable. Your body changed, you moved slower, got thinner. Rest was luxury. Movement was survival. Your home back then wasn't warm, comfortable, or private. It was a shelter, but just barely. It was built from whatever materials were nearby and cheap. The walls were made from woven sticks called wattle, which were then covered in a messy mix of mud, straw, and even animal dung. This mixture was called daub. It dried hard, but not solid enough to keep out the wind. Cold air still slipped through the cracks. On stormy nights, you could hear the wind whistling through the gaps. And sometimes you'd feel it too, creeping in under the door or through the corners of the room. The roof was usually thatched, made of layers of straw tied tightly together. It worked most of the time, but it wasn't perfect. Rain still found its way through the weak spots, dripping onto your head or soaking your bed. Birds sometimes made their nests up there, and mice would climb in too, scratching and squeaking above you as you tried to sleep. The floor wasn't made of wood or stone, it was just dirt. Hard-packed and cold, it stayed damp in winter and dusty in summer. When it rained outside, the floor turned to mud inside. There were no carpets, no tiles, no comfort under your feet. There were no glass windows. Instead, people used small holes in the walls to let in light. These were covered with thin pieces of parchment animal skin rubbed with grease to make. It's somewhat see-through. It let in a little light, but no view, and definitely no warmth. The door was simple, made of rough wood and often didn't close properly. The latch was basic, and on windy nights it might bang open if you didn't prop something against it. The fire pit was in the center of the room. There was no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let out the smoke. It wasn't very effective smoke. Filled the room before it slowly drifted upward, leaving everything inside coated in black soot. Your walls, clothes, and even your lungs carried the smoke with them. The fire was used for cooking, for warmth, and for light, but it didn't heat the whole room. The air near the floor stayed cold, and your toes might freeze even while your face felt the heat. Furniture was simple and handmade. A wooden bench or stool, maybe a rough table, was all you had. Beds were sacks stuffed with straw, shared by 2 or more people to stay warm. But straw beds weren't soft, they poked through the fabric, made your skin itch, and attracted lice, fleas, and other bugs. You tried to warm small stones by the fire and placed them at the foot of your bed, hoping they'd keep your toes warm a little longer. But the warmth faded quickly, and while your feet stayed frozen, the roof beams above, closer to the rising heat, were almost warm enough to melt snow. Candles were rare and expensive, made from animal fat. They gave off weak light, dripped constantly, and gave the room a greasy, unpleasant smell. At night, the house filled with sounds. The wind moaned through the walls, animals shuffled or made noises nearby, and your stomach often growled if you went to bed hungry. Everyone slept in one room, parents, children, sometimes even animals, so privacy didn't exist. You heard everything and were seen by everyone. Your home was not a place of peace or rest. It was a place to survive the night and hope the roof held. Animals lived with you, chickens in corners, goats under tables. Your home smelled like a barn. You swept, but dirt returned. Rats chewed grain. Cats ruled like furry kings. You patched roofs with rocks and hope, caught rain in buckets, and named leaky spots. You whispered to your hut like it was sick, just hold on. Wealthier peasants whitewashed walls to kill lice. You hung herbs, they crumbled into your soup. You dreamed of a second room but settled for not freezing to death. When dawn came, it didn't bring peace or beauty, it brought work. Every single day, without pause. There were no weekends, no holidays for rest. The first task was always the fire. If the embers from the night before had gone out, you had to restart it from scratch. That meant cold hands fumbling with flint and steel, trying to spark a flame while your fingers felt like blocks of ice. If you didn't get the fire going quickly, the house stayed cold, the water stayed frozen, and nothing else could begin. Next came the water. You had to fetch it from a stream, a well, or a river. It wasn't a short trip, and it wasn't easy. The buckets were heavy, the ground was icy, and one slip could spill everything and send you back again. People swore and grumbled under their breath, not because they were lazy, but because even the simplest task felt like a struggle in winter. You boiled water not because it made things clean, but because you needed it to warm food, to wash just a little, and sometimes just to stop your hands from freezing. The animals needed to be fed next scraps of food, wilted vegetables, maybe a handful of grain if any was left. Chickens needed their co-op cleared. Goats or cows needed to be milked. Snow had to be shoveled away from doorways and paths, not for comfort, but so you could move without slipping or getting trapped inside. Every task was about survival. Men would go out to work in the fields if the ground wasn't frozen solid, or head to the forest to gather wood, hunt, or check traps. Women stayed close to the home but worked just as hard. They spun wool into yarn for clothing, mended torn garments, hauled water again and again, and made sure everyone had something to eat, even if it wasn't much. Laundry day came once a week, and it was dreaded by all. You had to break the ice on a stream or trough just to get water. Clothes were scrubbed with ash and rough hands, often until your knuckles bled from the cold and friction. Cooking was a challenge. You learned how to stretch almost nothing into a meal. 3 turnips and a few scraps of salted meat had to become dinner for the whole family. The stew might be thin, the bread hard, and the ale watered down, but it filled stomachs enough to keep going. Everything that could be fixed had to be broken fences, cracked roofs, worn-out tools. You couldn't afford replacements. You had to make what you had last. Even children were expected to help. They weren't just playing, they held yarn. While mothers spun thread, helped scare crows away from stored grain, gathered firewood, or carried buckets. They learned early that survival meant contribution. Light faded quickly in winter, and by late afternoon, the sky was already dark. Dinner came early, usually a hot stew if you were lucky, hard bread to chew slowly, and weak ale just strong enough to warm your chest. After eating, the work didn't stop. You sewed holes in socks, patched worn-out cloaks, or checked that boots weren't falling apart. Children usually curled up by the fire to sleep, wrapped in whatever warmth could be found. Adults stayed up a little longer, tending the flame so the fire didn't die, or bringing in more wood so the morning wouldn't start in freezing darkness. By the time you finally lay down, you were so tired you didn't even finish your thoughts. Sleep came fast, heavy, and dreamless, only to be broken again by the cold gray light of dawn, and the work waiting to begin again. Getting sick was common. Damp huts, smoke, and crowded spaces bred coughs and fevers. Nobody covered mouths. Nobody knew about germs. Remedies were grim. Bleeding with dull knives, herbal teas that tasted like mud, fasting when you needed food most. Priests blamed sign. Barbers used filthy tools. Steam inhalations, prayers, hot coals on skin, nothing worked well. Sickness spread fast. Superstition ruled hanging herbs, iron under beds. You couldn't rest, wood needed chopping, animals needed feeding. If fever spiked, the priest came for last rites. Some recovered. Some didn't. Illness left you weak, quieter, changed. In the past, life wasn't just hard because of the cold or the hunger. It was hard because you had no power. You didn't own your land, your time, or even your choices. Everything belonged to someone else, usually a lord who controlled the land where you lived and worked. You were expected to farm that land, pay taxes or rents in the form of grain, eggs or labor, and show respect at all times. If you refused, there were consequences. The Lord's men could come to your home, take what little food you had left, or drag you to the village square and lock you in the stocks, even during a snowstorm. There you'd sit, freezing, while others passed by and stared, or worse, threw things. The church held just as much power as the Lord's, sometimes more. Missing Sunday Mass was noticed, and being seen as unholy could lead to whispers, suspicion, or even punishment. You were expected to give the church a tithe 10% of what you had. That might not sound like much, but when your harvest was already small, losing 10% could mean your family went hungry. You didn't just lose food, you lost pride. Giving eggs, grain, or animals you desperately needed was painful, but no one dared complain. The priest had influence. If he turned against you, so did everyone else. The laws of the land were harsh and unfair. They protected the strong lords, priests, and landowners, and crushed the poor. Steal a loaf of bread, even if your children were starving, and you could lose a hand. Gossip too much about the wrong person, and you might be forced to wear a heavy iron muzzle shaped like a cage around your head. It was meant to humiliate you in front of the entire village. Women had even less freedom. They were expected to obey their fathers, then their husbands, and eventually even their grown sons. A woman who spoke out too much or disobeyed was often punished, shamed, or ignored. People turned against each other, not always out of malice, but out of fear. Neighbors would report you for small things like working on a holy day, or not bowing low enough to a noble, because they were scared of being punished themselves. In winter, punishments felt even worse. A slap across your face hurt more on chapped, frozen skin. A cold cell or a public shaming could lead to sickness or death. You learned to survive by being quiet, polite, and useful. You worked hard, kept your head down, and tried not to draw attention. Children were taught these lessons early. They were warned not to speak out, not to question, and not to dream too big. Hoping for more freedom, more comfort, more fairness was dangerous. Instead, they were told to stay small, stay silent, and do what they were told. In a world where power ruled and winter punished the weak, survival came not from courage, but from obedience. Dangers lurked everywhere. Wolves grew bold by midwinter starving, watching. You felt them near when fetching wood or using the outhouse. Rats stole food, chewed leather. Stray dogs formed packs. Wild boar charged. Spiders and beetles invaded for warmth. You guarded stored food like treasure, hung it from rafters, swept mouse droppings from flour. Crows watched silently. Bandits stalked the hungry. You slept with a knife nearby. Every noise made your heart freeze. Wind, a branch, or claws at the door. You learned winter's language, tracks in snow. Silences that meant something watched. You checked locks, left fires low, slept ready. Religion was survival. You attended. Freezing masses fasted on empty stomachs, confessed sins to priests. Tithes paid for church wine while you ate turnip broth. Saints were lifelines, St. Eligius for sick cows, St. Anthony for lost axes. Relics, bones, teeth, holy rags drew desperate pilgrims. Priests called suffering God's plan. Villages became tents. Anyone could be blamed for storms or frozen crops. Heaven promised warmth, light, no hunger. You carved crosses, whispered rosaries, clung to hope. When death came often in winter, bodies waited in barns for thawed ground. Funerals were frost-covered and grim. Faith wasn't about joy, it was about enduring. Winter didn't end neatly. Spring was a rumor. March could be as cruel as January. Snow lingered, ice clung, winds howled. Mud replaced snow, boots grew heavy. By thaw, winter had starved people, broken bones, shattered spirits. Some doors stayed shut in April, whole families gone. The old man with a cough, the mother who gave her bread away, the child who faded in February. Survivors were thinner, quieter, flinching at loud noises. You planted seeds with frost-cracked hands, rebuilt roofs, hoed fields, all while still hungry. Trauma lived in hollow stares and night terrors. Nobody talked about it. You just said, "We made it." Spring didn't erase winter. Losses stayed. You found things in melting snow, a boot, a knife, a child's doll, and picked them up silently. Laughter returned, cautious and quiet. Green shoots gave fragile hope. You planted earlier, stored better, braced harder. But you knew another winter would come. You walked past graveyards without looking. You counted food twice. You listened for wolves in spring. Survival wasn't victory, it was endurance. No songs celebrated you. No records named you. Making it through winter was the only miracle peasants knew. And if you were still standing when the snow melted, that was the only victory that mattered.